The themes of the book are inspired by a trip that we took way back in 2014. And this was a visit to the city of Nantes in France, where we visited the International Slavery Museum. And they had on display there some beautiful textiles that we actually thought were African in origin because of the patterning and the colour. They were, I think, from 18th century, these textiles. But we were very surprised when the curator explained that they were actually Indian in origin and that they had been made for French merchants in India for specifically to exchange for enslaved Africans as part of the transatlantic slave trade. And that was an eye-opener to us because it's the first time that we had come to realise how India actually had a role to play in that triangle of slave trade. Normally people think of it obviously as that very specific geographic definition confined to Europe, Africa and the Americas, and here we have this interplay with India. So we were really fired up to find out more about that history. We returned home to England and we started researching the history of textiles in India. And the more we delved into this story, the more we realised that the trade in Indian textiles was actually a global story of conflict, enslavement, colonisation and consumerism. And this was a story that we really wanted to tell to our audiences as artists. So we decided to create a series of works around those themes, which is the core body of what the book is about. Well, the title of the book is Slaves of Fashion, but it's actually a bit of a hidden title because it's not specifically about fashion. It's looking at the history of empire and colonialism through the lens of trade in Indian textiles and the interlink between consumerism, enslavement, conflict. So it's really more about the entanglements of those histories. And fashion is just one aspect of that. It's really also about consumerism, not just of the past, but also of the present, because the book actually brings together past histories and shows their relevance today. Yeah, but we hope audiences who read the book will it'll get them thinking like it got us thinking, really, the trip that we made to Nantes, and thinking more about the definitions of empire and about kind of attitudes of empire that have been passed down through the generations, which many people see as some kind of a glorious part of history. And the book's very much about unearthing some of the darker hidden stories around empire and colonialism and how that still today affects certain attitudes of racism and attitudes around cultural ownership. Very many interesting aspects to that in the modern day world that people don't realise, and hopefully the work and the book will get people thinking about that more. Well, the original series of artworks, it was 4 years in the making, I think, from our initial inspiration, 2014. And it started off basically with research, as all of our work starts off with research. So, I mean, that's anything from, books to internet to interviews to TV, documentaries, and also looking at historical archive material as well. And part of that was looking at our local collections. So we're based in the Liverpool area. So we wanted to see how specifically the collections of National Museums Liverpool would fit into this whole story. As one of the key things we wanted to do was to show how historical objects have a contemporary relevance too, how they can speak to contemporary audiences. So a lot of the artworks were initially inspired by rummaging through the archives at National Museums Liverpool, and we weren't just looking at textiles. We were looking right across the board from textiles to jewellery to teapots, all sorts of things, historical prints, and trying to make those connections. Very much unexpected connections, I think, between different objects and how they're linked into this common story of empire and colonialism. And so after we'd done that research, we then really pulled our ideas, difficult part really was actually trying to identify different themes to paint. I mean, it was such a vast subject. But we managed to kind of categorize in about 10 or so subjects, which were also interconnecting. And then we divided those subjects between us to then hone in on more research before actually thinking about the different compositions of the artworks. The artworks are a combination of different mediums as well and techniques. So there are some painted artworks. There are artworks that are a combination of painted elements that are scanned in the computer and then reworked digitally. And there are also visual elements within the artworks that are created entirely within the computer, starting with a blank screen. And all those come together in the presentation of the final artwork, many of which are digital mixed medium. So they were displayed as these large-scale light box backlit artworks, which were printed onto fabric and lit behind. The book really, for us, we needed it to be a reflection of what our artwork is about, and we're generally known for creating works that are highly narrative, very detailed, attention to detail, and yet precision and decorative elements. So we wanted the book to reflect those qualities. The first issue we had is to format the artworks. Obviously, most of our work is scanned digitally anyway. We're very good at kind of keeping a record of all of our art. So that was the first stage of the process of making the book, to get everything digitally scanned. We then had to select some of the artworks that appear in the book as complete artworks, which weren't too much of a problem. But there are other aspects of the book where we pull out elements of those works. So we had to then start using digital tools to cut out details from some of the works to recreate in the book. And then we wanted to also translate some of the time lapses videos that have been shown within the exhibition, showing the creative processes. So again, we just had to take stills from the time lapses to show different stages of creating, from the drawing right the way through to the finished part of the detail of the artwork. But we've been pretty much involved from the entire production of the book. So the initial concept for the book was ours. We had the hands-on approach to actually designing the book, which we wanted it to have this very decorative feel, to create something that was as beautiful as it was informative and educational and thought-provoking, really. I think in that sense, we were hoping it would act like our artwork. I mean, many people say to us that it's the aesthetics of our artwork that draw people in to have a closer look. And I think if a book's not attractive to begin with, people aren't going to pick it up. So it was very important that it was very aesthetically, pleasing. Some of the symbols that we use are repeated in different artworks and even take on a different meaning depending on the context. Flowers play a big part in our art in terms of symbolism, and one particular symbol, for example, is the buttercup, which is a symbol of wealth. And we find this in the portrait of Calico Jack, who represents the East India Company and the whole concept of piracy and plunder of India. So on his jacket, you see it's covered in buttercups. Then you see the same buttercup in another artwork, which is a contemporary context artwork showing the legacy, if you like, of empire and commercial greed, called Profit Without Conscience, or the Worship of Profit Without Conscience. And it shows the haves and have-nots, and the haves, if you like, the wealthy, are shown by the symbol of the buttercup in that work. We also use symbols that are non-floral. So there's an artwork called Indiennes, the extended triangle. And within that, there's a depiction of a palm oil pot from the 18th century. And that represents, really symbolises the kinds of trades that were involved in the exchange for African slaves, palm oil being one thing, Indian textiles being another, and many other elements around the painting which point to other trade goods as well. But the same palm oil symbol, if you like, is picked up and carried forward in another of the artworks in the Slaves of Fashion series, which is Because You're Worth It, ? And this is about the palm oil industry today, or more specifically, unsustainable palm oil production. And it's looking really at how the sort of trade practices of the past, of the colonial era, continue in the present in terms of the exploitation of lands and people. Because one thing that the book is also about is showing how colonialism and empire has left a very deep legacy on the modern world. The Slaves of Fashion series picks up on our dual Indian-British heritage and our very eclectic way of working as artists, in that stylistically it draws upon Indian miniature painting as one of the foremost influences on our work, but also artworks from the Western traditions, such as the Pre-Raphaelites, for example. But it also has this interplay between East and West, because the Slaves of Fashion story is also about the exchange of cultures and ideas and people. And that shared history between India and Britain. So there are works in the the book that actually deal with specifically that theme. So one of them, for example, is the Kashmiri shawl story, which we've come to call in the West, or in Britain in particular, the Paisley shawl, because it's associated with the town of Paisley in Scotland that became famous during the Victorian period for producing these shawls. When actually the Paisley shawl originates from India, and it's not called Paisley there, it's called the Kashmiri shawl. And then there's another work which is focused on the chintz fabric. And again, chintz is something that's been, kind of for many years in UK associated as being something that's quintessentially very English. Yet it's a design, this we're wearing now, this floral pattern that originates in India. So the idea of this dual identity and kind of crossover of cultures, which is, we affiliate ourselves very much as being brought up in two different worlds, if you like, both in kind of the West and having our Indian roots too, is something that's very much reflected through the artworks. I think society is reckoning with many of the issues in the book. One of them, for example, being attitudes to race today. And I know, in particular, more recent history with the murder of George Floyd, I think there's been a huge movement. You only have to look at media and advertising to see how people are now becoming much more conscious about their ingrained racial attitudes. How to address those, yeah. I mean, it's also in terms of consumerism. I think a lot more people are looking towards organic products, for example. I think when we first started this book in 2014, there were movements just beginning to be conscious about these things, and sustainable cotton and on all of those debates, which are really picking up now. But I think we have a long way to go before we're kind of finally there. We've kind of set the world in a sort of path of disaster in terms of the environment, which is going to be difficult to pull back from. But I think books like this, and as long as we keep those debates alive, we have a much better chance of pulling ourselves back from the brink of disaster. Well, we've always believed in the power of art to communicate on every subject. And we've always said that, it's always very sad to see that art is always the first thing to be, kicked off the curriculum by the government as seen as something that's not really of any value, when actually you can teach every other subject through art. So in our eyes, it's probably the most important subject, and you can teach in such an accessible way through art as well. So I think, art has always been a powerful tool for propaganda, for communicating, for satire. We're very much inspired by the likes of Gilray and their satirical prints. And it's a way of getting across very serious, hard-hitting messages in a very accessible way and a non-threatening way, I think, that encourages people to look at what you're saying and think about what you're saying without feeling that you're trying to somehow bamboozle them into a particular way of thinking. It's a way of bringing people into difficult subjects gently, if you like, and getting them to find out things about themselves, giving them the will to find out things for themselves. I think readers hopefully can take away many different things from the book. It's a book for art lovers, so it can just be enjoyed for the art, for art's sake. But there's also other aspects where people want to learn about history. That through that history, they also learn about themselves and the world around them, which perhaps gets them to think about whether it's their consumer attitudes or their attitudes to the communities they live in, or even an in-depth knowledge about where they come from, because the history of colonialism is about all of us, and we all have a connection to it in ways that we don't really fully understand or know. And I hope this book will help to unlock all of those questions.